Now to Cuba, where protests across the island are posing a serious challenge to the socialist leadership. Why the protests now? How has the regime reacted? And will supporters of socialism around the world finally criticize the Cuban government? I'm joined by Chris Sabatini, a senior fellow at Chatham House who specializes in the politics of Latin America. Chris, thanks for joining us on Spectator TV. To start, are these protests just a reaction to the consequences of the pandemic or something bigger happening?
These are long-standing demands and grievances the Cuban people have had. I mean, obviously the pandemic has worsened them. First of all, because of the lack of access to medicine and the collapsed healthcare system. Cuba is often celebrated for its revolution in healthcare, but the truth is it's fallen apart long ago. It's deeply romanticized and now pretty much a myth. And so what you're seeing is people's reaction to that, but also the economy has crumbled. In 2020, the economy contracted by 11%. And that's largely because of the restrictions on COVID that led to the tourism declining, dropping off almost entirely, not just from the United States because of the embargo, but from Europe, from Latin America, from Canada. But also the economy itself is just creaking along. It's a tired old communist system that's failing to produce enough food for the people, has to import most of its food. And as the economy and the country try to unify its very complicated dual exchange rate, just last year, that led to a spike in the prices of imported food. And so people were experiencing both shortages and high prices in most of the dollar or foreign currency exchange stores. So between healthcare, between lack of access to food, outright hunger, to be perfectly honest, and malnutrition, and just desperation, that's what we're seeing expressed now. But obviously COVID was probably the tipping point, at least in terms of the healthcare concerns of COVID.
And the government is, of course, blaming the United States, but the protesters simply aren't buying it.
Yeah, of course they're blaming the United States, and they would. They can't admit their own failures, and so they go to the traditional straw man of blaming the U.S. embargo. And the embargo may be a clumsy policy tool. Personally, I think that's the case, but it's not the reason for why there are shortages or why the economy has failed or even why the healthcare system is falling apart. And they're also blaming the United States, alleging that it supported the protesters. But you need only look at the number of cities in which people have taken to the streets across Cuba and realize that this can't be orchestrated from anyone or anywhere, but also the nature of the protests themselves. These people aren't demanding necessarily regime change, although that's an element of it, given the brittleness of the regime and its lack of accountability. They're really demanding just basic goods, bread and butter issues. And that's really what's driving this. And for that reason, this really cuts to the quick for the Cuban government. I mean, it's failed to provide for its people. This is a revolution that sort of sustained itself largely on the myth, but sustained itself on the idea that it's a revolution that provides for the poor. And it simply can't tolerate the idea that suddenly those people are taking to the streets and denouncing the government and their own, and announcing to the world their own basic needs. One interesting thing, by the way, about the protest, if you look at the videos, what you see is these are not the traditional human rights activists and dissidents that have often been, if you will, sort of part of U.S. discussion and dialogue on these issues. Largely, these are Afro-descendant Cubans, people who would have decades ago claimed to have benefited from the revolution are now taking to the streets. So this really goes to the very heart of the revolution and its own failings.
So in his piece for The Spectator this week, Rory says this sort of thing just doesn't happen in Cuba. And you're hinting at that as well, that something feels really different this time compared to how it's been in the past.
Yeah, I would say there are a couple of things that are different within the island, Kate. The first is that we see, again, the socioeconomic differences of this, just in terms of the people on the streets, their racial composition, their age, multi-sectoral, as I mentioned, it's artists, it's artisans, it's small entrepreneurs. The second thing that's different about this is their coordination by social media. And this is unheard of. You're seeing, for the first time, people plan and organize Facebook events, share videos of crackdowns, but also of protesters, which has added to a certain element of courage. People are sort of saying, we're not afraid. That's what they're saying. And this is very much in the article that you mentioned, The Spectator. And that's important. People suddenly, they feel empowered. Social media is at their fingertips. And we've seen, of course, as you would expect, the Cuban government just tried to shut down the internet. It can't entirely, but it's tried to nip this in the bud. There's two other things that make this important. Another one, as I mentioned, is that this is about bread and butter issues. Yes, it's about freedom. Yes, it's about human rights. Yes, it's about denouncing the regime. But it really is about socioeconomics at its heart. And that's unique in many ways. And I think it's a very powerful message. There's one last thing that's very important about this is as media has become more savvy and international, as the regime has had to tolerate some pushes by the international community to open up in some ways, marginally, we now have a really good cohort of international correspondents that are on the ground, as well as working with independent journalists from Cuba, in Cuba, on the ground, reporting on this. So in this case, what we're seeing is that the actions of these people are being broadcast through social media, through traditional media, but also through local media. Independent journalists, as I mentioned, like Joanny Sanchez and others, are posting this and blogging about it and reporting it in live time, but they're also reporting on the crackdown that we've seen. There are pictures of bloodied, one person has died, a bloodied photographer from the AP. This is going to be very, very powerful because often in the past, the numbers of journalists, that space has been very limited, and consequently, basically the regime has been able to repress with impunity.
Well, you mentioned at the start of this interview that many of the reasons that protesters have taken to the streets are that they are disappointed with what is, quite frankly, a failed socialist regime. As you point out, there's a lot of international attention on this now because the press, from very local press to the international press, is giving it quite rightly that attention. I've noticed that a lot of voices who would often be sympathetic to those ideas in the international community and in Western countries are oddly silent on this one. Do you think they're going to have to pipe up and make a comment on it at some point?
You know, I'm not sure about that. Lenin referred to people like that as useful idiots for the revolution. They sort of unwittingly enabled or complied with revolution and the denial of people's rights. I think it's going to be very difficult for some people to part with the myth and the romanticization of the Castros, of the regime. I'd like to believe that, but having worked on Cuba for a long time and having experienced and tried to mobilize people to react to crackdowns in the past, for example, the Black Spring of 2003, I've just been astounded by the double standards and hypocrisy of people who are willing to denounce human rights abuses, say in Chile under Pinochet, and then just suddenly shy away from doing so in Cuba. And I suspect that may be the case. I mean, there are a few, I think, that will start to speak out. Michelle Bachelet, who's a High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN, has been very shy about speaking out before on Cuba. In fact, it's alleged, I haven't confirmed this, that she has never personally spoken out on human rights abuses in Cuba. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to do that. But I think other people, a number of academics, journalists and the like, artists, are going to be a little bit reticent to do that. And it's a shame because whereas in the past, maybe they could try to fool themselves. Maybe when a Castro was in power, they could claim that this was the mantle of a revolutionary leader and they're still beholden to all those myths of the revolution. But now it's post-Castro and the images are clear, not just of the crackdown, but also the people that are on the streets. But I hate to sound cynical, I don't have any great faith in people that before have been silent suddenly speaking up.
Yeah, I'm going to be cynical along there with you. And I'm also going to ask you a very broad question, so forgive me in advance, but I'm just so curious about how the political attitudes are shifting in Cuba. Now, we want to avoid stereotypes because like any other country, you're going to have a broad spectrum of political opinion. But in relation to these protests, I mean, if they were to have some success, what would that success look like? And what are the new political demands that are growing in Cuba? And is there a divide between, say, the younger generations and the older generations that might be slightly more sympathetic to the regime?
Well, it's a good question, and it's difficult, as you say, because Cuba's diverse, it's large, it's a country of 11 million people. I just tell a few anecdotes about this, because I think they're illustrative. One time I was in Cuba, I was having dinner with a group of young people, not necessarily activists, they were just University of Havana students and the like, young professionals, and I asked them, what do you think? Because by way of context, most people in Cuba recognize the failings of the regime. They recognize and they'll speak quietly and in hushed tones about the need for change, but they don't really want to speak out. And I asked these young Cubans, what do you hope for? And almost to a person, they said, we hope to leave. We have no future here. And that's very difficult. And what's interesting now is suddenly is that sense of desperation, that lack of hope, may suddenly be being challenged to the street rather than an effort to flee. And that's positive. And I think once you build that sense of hope, then you get what your article says as people start to speak about the lack of fear. They're not afraid. And I think that's very, very important. In terms of pockets of support for the regime, it's very difficult to tell. Of course, there are people in the government who very much support the regime, but you never know. When I used to teach at Columbia University, I would tell my students, try and describe what it's like in Cuba and the conversations you have privately with people. Imagine working in an office where the same boss has been in power for 60 years. How frustrating would that be? That person just personally controls everything that happens in the office, and it depends on his whim. Would not be a work environment that you'd want to work in. So we don't even know within the government how much they support this. And last, there's one other element to this, which is very different, which is there's not a Castro in power right now. Last year, Raul Castro stepped down from the presidency of the Communist Party. Before that, he stepped down from the presidency of the country. And this is going to be important because you don't have that myth of the revolution again. You don't have the cadre of guerrillas that were around Fidel and Raul Castro in power anymore. It's a new generation, and they lack that legitimacy, that sort of revolutionary cred, if you will. And consequently, what you've heard from Miguel Diaz-Canel, the president, is he's going to respond in a revolutionary manner. What he's saying is, I'm no different than the Castros. I'm going to respond the same way with an iron fist. And it's a message not just to the people, and he's called them as revolutionaries to the streets. It's also a message to those around him saying, I'm not going to give up. We're not going forward. This is the same old regime, and I'm abiding by our jefe máximo, our chief leader, the now deceased Fidel Castro.
Chris, thanks for coming on the show.